Guys, we are going to continue yesterday's lecture using Ed Puzzle. So this is a continuation of Evolution 7.1.2. So we started talking about natural selection and some of the scientists that helped to shape Darwin's thought. And then we continued on to some of the aspects of what natural selection really is. And we looked at the beak of the finch and saw some scientists in action, and looked at a graph of how the finch species have diversified on the Galapagos Islands. Well, we're going to continue onwards with a little bit of that information, and then look at some of the evidence that we do have for supporting evolution or common origin of all living organisms. All right, to summarize, let's look at what Darwin actually said in The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published in 1859. If you have a copy of this book, by the way, a first edition, it would be worth close to $500,000. Anyways, Darwin's main ideas can be summarized in 3 points. Number 1, natural selection is differential success in reproduction. All that means is that some individuals are going to survive at a higher rate than others, and they're going to produce more young than others, therefore contributing more of their genes to the gene pool. And remember, evolution is defined as a change in allele frequency in the gene pool. Okay? Again, natural selection occurs through an interaction between the environment and individual organisms. And remember, all organisms are different from each other. So some organisms are going to, some individuals may have a slightly better sequence or combination of genes that allows them to get more food or survive at a higher rate, all in all to produce more young than their neighbors or members of the same species. Therefore, they will produce more young, pass their genes on at a higher rate. And number 3, the product of natural selection is going to be the adaptation of populations, not individuals. Remember, individuals do not evolve. Individuals are selected for or against it to reproduce, but the population is the unit that undergoes evolution. Okay, so over time, that population will adapt to the environment. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw up, we looked at a phylogenetic tree of Darwin's finches, but this is a phylogenetic tree of all life. And if we go all the way to the left-hand side, we look at that original cell. That is somewhere between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years ago. And we're talking about a heterotrophic, prokaryotic bacteria-like cell. Okay? These gave rise to 2 groups of bacteria, the archaebacteria, which are still around today, and those are things that we find living in hot springs, the thermophiles, living in very salty areas, the haliophiles, or ones that live in areas rich in methane, such as your gut, which we call the methanogens, and then the eubacteria. And then we have the eukarya, the ancestral eukaryotic cell, where we estimate somewhere about 2 billion years ago. And remember, if you look at the bottom there, you see from the eubacteria, you see this line going over mitochondria and chloroplasts. Remember, that's endosymbiosis. Okay, and then those ancient eukaryotic cells eventually gave rise to the animals, the fungi, the protists, and the plants. So, conclusion of natural selection is that it is simply differential survival and reproductive success, where the environment acts as the screener of the variations produced each generation. Those individuals best suited for a particular set of habitat variables will pass on their genes to the next generation in a greater proportion than less fit individuals. That's it in a nutshell, guys. Now, remember, Darwin was not the first person to say that species change over time. There was also Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French biologist. And his idea was, however, that individuals passed on the traits that they acquired during their lifetime, or that because they didn't use something, then that wouldn't show up in the future. generations. So looking at how the necks, how giraffes got their long necks, Lamarck would say that individuals would have to stretch to get their food, and their necks got longer as they stretched during their lifetime, and then they passed that stretched neck on to their offspring. That would be like Arnold Schwarzenegger when his babies were born with Maria Shriver, that the baby was huge and muscular and was able to bench press the mom, but that's not the case. All right, now Darwin said that the individuals were born. There was variation in those individuals. Some had slightly longer necks. Those ones that had slightly longer necks were able to get more food, therefore produce more young and bring those young to adulthood. And they passed those longer neck genes on to the young, and they produced more young, and some of those had longer necks, and so on and so on and so on. Key points of natural selection. Number 1. Populations always produce more young than the environment can support. That just says that, a bird may lay 15 eggs in a season, but luckily if only one is able to survive to adulthood, if any survive to adulthood. Okay? And what's the result of that? How do we know that? Is because we don't see these rapidly growing populations in all species. We see that the populations tend to remain relatively stable in terms of numbers. We also know that resources are limited and that individuals compete for these resources. And as Darwin noted, individuals in a population are different from one another, and much of those differences can be passed on from generation to generation. Those individuals that have the best combination of those traits that they got from their parents are the ones that are able to survive to reproduce. And that's going to cause changes in allele frequencies as the environment changes. So again, evolution occurs as allele frequencies change within a population. 2 pictures here. The top one is a blue-footed booby, and the other one is a marine iguana, both species that are endemic. It is spelled endemic, to the Galapagos Islands. And endemic basically means that's the only place they are found. Examples of natural selection, how that does provide evidence for evolution. You've all heard about antibiotic resistance. It's a huge, huge problem. How does it work? Well, when you take antibiotics, that's going to kill off most of the bacteria that are not resistant to that particular antibiotic. But antibiotics are actually produced by other bacteria. So some bacteria via mutations, have the ability to withstand the antibiotic. And so when you take antibiotics, and you're basically going to kill off all of the non-resistant bacteria. But if you stop taking your antibiotics, there are going to be those species of bacteria that were resistant, and they are the ones that are going to now repopulate your body, and that's how resistance develops. We'll talk about that some more in class. Pesticide resistance. As you spray pesticides on a field, that is going to cause the insects to die, but again, via mutation, some insects are able to survive that pesticide, and once again, they are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce and pass the genes on to, of pesticide resistance to future generations. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about sickle cell anemia and the CCR5 delta 32 gene in class. Just ask me about it in class. This is what Darwin studied. Okay, he looked at how in a very short period of time we're able to produce a whole variety of dogs. And when Darwin was alive, this was a time of great experimentation with dog breeding. All of a sudden, dogs became kind of like the toy of the rich, if you will, and they started to produce all these small toy breeds like the poodles, small poodles, and things of that nature, this French bulldogs and stuff. And Darwin was amazed at how quickly this could happen. And it was called artificial selection because we, i.e. humans, are the selective factor and not nature. That's where natural selection comes from. Another example of that is looking at plants, where we select different traits of plants in order to supply food for us. all of these vegetables, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi, have all come from wild mustard plants, which actually grow here in Alabama all over the place. And different people started to select for different parts of those flowers. They found a mutant, maybe one that had slightly larger leaves, and they basically they bred that plant and got kale. Or ones that had short internodes, and they bred that one and they got cabbages, and so on and so on. Again, we are the selective factor. Structures. Okay, a great example. These homologous structures basically have a common evolutionary origin, and they are made up of the same types of tissues. A great example of homologous structures is looking at the forelimbs of the vertebrates. Okay, humans, lizards, cats, whales, bats, and frog, they all have the same pattern. One bone, two bones, many bones, fingers. And again, the one bone is the humerus, the two bones are the radius and ulna, the many bones are the wrist bones, or the carpal, and the fingers, of course, the 1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s there. This pattern is seen all throughout the vertebrates. Where did it come from? Well, it came from fish, basically, and we'll look at a short video of that shortly. Embryological homologies. Okay, when we look at embryos of fish, salamanders, tortoise, chicks, rabbits, and man, at various stages they all look really similar. Why do they look similar? Because the same genes are being turned on. The genes to build the head, the gene to build the backbone, the gene to put the eyes in, the genes to put the heart in the various places. All the same genes. Okay, it's only as the embryological development progresses is that we see mutations that occurred that led to new genes and therefore new phenotypes, new shapes, new structures as we go on. And we look at this phylogenetically, i.e. from time. Fish have been around for about 500 million years, maybe 450 million years. Salamanders, 350 million years. Most reptiles were starting somewhere around 280 million years ago. Birds about 170 to 180 million years ago. Mammals, well, the very early mammals, close to 280 million years ago, and they were reptiles. We call them the mammal-like reptiles, animals called thecodonts. Okay, and eventually, after the death of the dinosaurs, I should say the death of the large dinosaurs, in 65 million years ago, mammals were able to sort of take over. And then, of course, man, we being a primate that evolved relatively recently, 200,000 years ago or so, from modern man. Once again, our fossil evidence is very, very well documented, looking at the transition from fish to amphibian or I should say fish to land animal, and we'll look at a short film with that, or if you want to click on that the origin of tetrapods link, or just Google that. There's a great little film. We'll try and watch that one in class. But we do have a great fossil record, and it's getting better all the time. Vestigial structures. These are structures that are found that we really no longer have any use for, but they're part of our evolutionary past. Back when we used to do a lot of whaling, every once in a while, leg bones would be found in whales. Okay, and they're like, what? Where did that come from? Legs don't have whales. But they did. 56 to 35 million years ago was the age of whale evolution, and that is Pachycetus, one of the earliest whales. And as you can see, it is a four-legged land animal that was found living along, the fossils were found living in an environment that was kind of a swampy-like environment. So this was probably almost like an alligator-like mammal that prowled the swamps. And over time, and we, again, great fossil record for this. We can look at this one a little bit later in class. Vestigial structures. We have tails. It's called the coccyx. And as you look at this picture on the right, we see S1 through S5. Those are the normal bones. Every once in a while, C1 through C3 can be found. Okay, and humans are born with some tails. These are genes that have been turned off. These genes were turned off probably about, I'm trying to think now off the top of my head, 15 to 20 million years ago. Because the great apes also, which we are a member of, also do not have tails. So this gene was disrupted, this tail-producing gene was disrupted somewhere between 15 and 20 million years ago. Okay, and molecular archaeologists, those are people who are looking in the DNA for ancient genes, have found these genes, which we call pseudogenes, that have been turned off. Here's our primate phylogenetic tree. I just want to show you. So if we look at this picture up here, we can see where the genes for tails were turned off. And as you can see up here, we go from the bottom starting at 63 million years ago, where we have our stem primates. Lemurs are an ancient form of primate, as are tarsiers. Okay, and then about 40 million years ago, we had a split, and one group would evolve to become the New World monkeys in South and Central America, and the other group would become the Old World monkeys found in Africa and Asia. About 25 million years ago became the split that divided off the macaques and the colobus monkeys. And as you can see, between 25 and 18 million years ago, the tail has been lost. Okay, so the gibbons, the orangutans, the gorillas, the chimps, and us man do not have tails. And if you look at this diagram, we can see that that split that happened between humans and what would eventually become us and what would eventually become a modern day chimpanzee happened between, actually now we think more about 7 million years ago, not 6 million years ago. Anyways, that is our primate phylogenetic tree. We can go into that in a lot more detail in class, but I wanted to give you that information. Biography, another piece of evidence. This is what we call Gondwana. Okay, so somewhere about 60 million years ago, South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia were all connected. How do we know that? Well, we look at the fossils we found, and we also look at the geology. Okay, these animals could not go across water, so the only way we could find the Cynonathus, a Triassic land reptile in South America and Africa, is if these were connected. And the geology between the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa are the same. They're the same deposits. Okay, we look at the plant Glossopteris. That is found in Australia, Antarctica, India, Madagascar, Africa, and South America. This plant has seeds that cannot be dispersed via land or water. So these continents had to have been connected at this point. Okay, so this is some of the evidence that we use to understand how species made it around the globe. Talk a little bit about convergent evolution. This is when you get similar forms in organisms that come from very different backgrounds. Here we have a shark, an ichthyosaur, and a dolphin. A shark's a fish. An ichthyosaur was an ancient reptile. They're no longer alive anymore. And a dolphin is a mammal, which was once a four-legged land organism. All of these animals have the same shape. They're fusiform. It allows them to move through the water. They have big teeth. They're top-level predators. Very good adaptations for seeing. Ichthyosaurs had really big eyes. Okay, so this is an example of convergent evolution. Looking at here, the wings are an example of convergent evolution. It's also an example of analogous structures. The wings can all play a role in flying, but they have different evolutionary backgrounds. At a deeper level, the wings are also homologous because they have that one bone, two bone, many bones, fingers that we saw when we talked about homologous structures. So it all depends upon how deep we're looking in terms of time.